Okay, so a different man. Um, Even the title kind of gives us a clue about what we're going to be talking about today, identity and transformation and kind of like how we see ourselves. We're going to be looking at some reviews for this film and also the synopsis, the film directed by Aaron Schimberg.
And it seems like from what critics are saying, it's going to be, it's not an easy film to categorize, is it? You've got surreal and darkly hilarious, melancholic, and even body horror,
Yeah,
black humor. So it'll be interesting to see how all those things kind of come together.
definitely. Well, let's start with the main character, Edward. The synopsis describes him as an aspiring actor who decides to have this radical procedure to change how he looks. So it seems like maybe even before this transformation, he's already kind of struggling with, his self-image.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, is he trying to fix something that's external? Or is it something that's going on internally that's driving this really drastic change?
Right.
A lot of the reviewers are saying it's the latter. They're saying that the film's really a commentary on identity and that sort of fine line between wanting to change and then, becoming obsessed with it.
Yeah. One reviewer even went as far as comparing Edward's journey to The Substance, but with kind of an added layer of self-doubt, which they said was reminiscent of characters in Dostoevsky's work.
Oh, wow.
And for people who maybe aren't familiar with Dostoevsky, he really explored those themes of guilt and shame and kind of the torment of the human psyche. So pretty heavy stuff.
Sounds pretty intense, yeah.
Yeah.
So it seems like the film really kind of grapples with these themes through this transformation that Edward goes through. I mean, he's not just changing physically, is he? He's really wrestling with how he sees himself and how that's shaped by, what society expects. And all of this is brought to life by Sebastian Stan. And critics are describing his performance as sensational, intense, and things like that.
Yeah. Some are even saying this could be his best performance yet, which is really interesting because it's such a departure from what we've seen from him before.
Yeah.
In films like Pam and Tommy and Fresh. One reviewer even mentioned that they initially mistook Stan in makeup for Adam Pearson.
Oh, wow.
Who actually plays another key character in the film.
Yeah, that's amazing. It just shows how much Stan was committed to, completely changing himself for this role.
Yeah.
So that brings us to Adam Pearson's character, Oswald. And it's interesting because while Edward is going through all this inner turmoil, Oswald seems to be coming at it from a totally different angle. He seems to be all about self-acceptance, and reviewers are really praising Pearson for his performance, calling him magnetic and charismatic and saying that he steals every single scene he's in.
Wow. So it sounds like their dynamic is really important to the film's exploration of identity. You have Edward, who's battling all these societal pressures and his own self-doubt. And then you have Oswald, who is navigating the world with this, confidence. And it's almost like he's challenging those insecurities just by being himself. I'm really interested to see how their paths kind of intertwine and what Edward might learn from Oswald's, outlook on life.
Yeah, it's not just about their journeys as individuals, is it? It seems like the film's also taking aim at, society's obsession with appearance. One of the reviewers even described the film as a dark comedy, highlighting just how absurd it is that we place so much emphasis on, outward beauty.
Right. And speaking of dark comedy, quite a few reviewers mentioned the climax of the film as being, satirical as hell. So it seems like instead of just being a straightforward drama, a different man is using humor and satire to kind of expose how shallow our beauty standards really are and the crazy things we do to try to be accepted. But it kind of makes you wonder, can a person's true self really overcome those prejudices that society has based on how we look?
Yeah, that's the question that the film seems to be asking, and some reviewers say it doesn't give you an easy answer. Instead, they present Edward's journey as this, cautionary tale, almost like a warning that if you become obsessed with change, it can be self-destructive.
So you have Edward struggling with this transformation, and Oswald, who seems to be showing a totally different perspective on self-acceptance. But then there's another character who adds another layer to this whole idea of identity, the love interest, played by Renee Reinsve. And from what I'm reading, it sounds like things get a little complicated when she comes into the picture. So reviewers describe the love interest as this artist who uses Edward's story as, inspiration for her work.
Yeah.
But they also sort of hint that she might be kind of taking advantage of his experience, to benefit her own career. It kind of adds this whole layer of moral ambiguity to the film, which is interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It really raises some questions about art in general. Where do we draw the line between being inspired by something and then exploiting it?
Right.
Can you really tell someone else's story without kind of taking it over and making it your own?
Yeah. One reviewer even points to this red typewriter as a symbol of, like, her manipulation. They're suggesting that she's using her art to almost rewrite Edward's story and maybe even, like, erase his true self in the process, which is kind of scary.
Wow. That idea of erasure actually ties back to what we were saying earlier about, societal pressures and how they can make us question who we are. It's like both Edward and the love interest are trying to reshape their identities. He's doing it through this physical transformation, and she's doing it through her art.
Right. It's almost like a double transformation where both characters are trying to find their own power in a world that's constantly trying to define them.
Yeah.
And it seems like their paths collide in a way that forces them to confront their own ideas of who they are.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting because the reviewers all kind of point to this one scene, Oswald's karaoke performance, as a turning point in the film.
Oh, okay.
They say it's this moment of pure joy and self-expression,
Okay.
which is like the complete opposite of what Edward is going through internally.
I can definitely see how that scene would highlight the different ways that these characters approach life and how they choose to, like, express themselves. It's like Edward is so focused on changing how he looks on the outside that he's maybe missing out on the simple joys of just being present and accepting himself for who he is.
Exactly. And this contrast between Edward and Oswald could be really important to understanding what the film is ultimately trying to say about identity. One reviewer even described their dynamic as this, like, one-sided rivalry, which they said perfectly displays how your inner self will always define you more than your physical appearance.
So even though Edward has gone through this massive physical transformation, the film is suggesting that real change has to come from within. It's about facing those inner demons,
Yeah.
the self-doubt and the insecurities, the things Dostoevsky wrote about.
Yeah, and it seems like the film explores these really complex themes by using a mix of genres and tones. Some reviewers found that really interesting. We've talked about the dark comedy and satire, but others use terms like melancholy, body horror, even ironic tragedy to describe it.
It sounds like the filmmakers are intentionally kind of pushing boundaries, creating this experience that makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, but also makes you think. One reviewer even called it an odd and mean little movie, but then said they loved it precisely because it was so different.
It's like they're using these contrasting elements to show the inner turmoil of the characters and the different forces that are at play in the story.
Right.
And they're not just using these contrasting elements in the story itself. They also use visuals in the soundtrack. One reviewer described the whole experience as like a, bizarre, wonderful fever dream. It shows just how much the film can pull you into this world that feels familiar and strange at the same time.
Yeah, that immersive quality probably adds a whole other dimension to the film's exploration of identity. It's not just telling a story, it's creating this experience that allows viewers to feel the weight of societal pressures and the emotional impact of transformation. But we need to talk about the play within the film before we wrap things up. The one that the love interest wrote, seemingly inspired by Edward's journey.
Yeah, the play. That seems to be where the film's, meta-narrative comes into play. We already mentioned how she might be exploiting Edward's story, right?
Right.
And how that raises all these questions about whether it's ethical for artists to use someone else's pain for their own creative expression. Does the artist owe anything to the person whose story they're telling?
Yeah, these are complicated questions, and it seems like the film doesn't try to provide simple answers. The fact that Edward's physical transformation has basically erased his past identity makes it even more ambiguous.
Oh.
Like, who owns his story now? Is it the man he used to be, the man he is now, or the artist who's telling it? It's like the film is questioning the very nature of storytelling and how our stories are constantly being reshaped, not just by ourselves, but by other people.
That's a really interesting point. And, that exploration of narrative control connects back to the themes of identity and how society sees us. It suggests that our stories are never really just our own. They're always being influenced by outside forces, by the ways society tries to define us.
It sounds like this play within a film is a really powerful metaphor for the film's overall message about how complex transformation can be,
right,
both physically and in terms of how our stories are told.
Exactly. It's like a mirror reflecting back on the main story, highlighting the ethical issues and the power dynamics involved in telling someone else's story.
Now I'm even more curious about how the film ends. The reviewers mentioned this satirical as hell climax, which suggests that the filmmakers aren't afraid to make a bold statement about these really complicated themes.
Yeah. It seems like the film builds to a point where it directly challenges this idea that inner beauty can overcome external obstacles. One reviewer even asked, Could a sick man in the real world succeed just by having a great personality?
That's a really thought-provoking question.
Hmm.
It makes you question this idea that we can just will ourselves into a better life no matter what our circumstances are.
Right.
It acknowledges that the world can be a harsh place and that we all face limitations.
Yeah, and it brings us back to that central tension between internal and external forces. It seems like the film doesn't offer a simple solution or a happy ending. Instead, it leaves you thinking about the complexities of identity and how our lives are shaped by things we can control and things we can't.
So it sounds like A Different Man doesn't shy away from like the tough stuff about transformation.
Yeah.
And yet the fact that self-improvement doesn't always solve everything.
Yeah.
But even without those like clear answers, it seems like critics are really impressed with the film.
Yeah, definitely. They're praising it for being so thought-provoking and the way it kind of shakes things up in terms of storytelling. One even described it as, a bizarre, wonderful fever dream, which sounds like a pretty intense cinematic experience.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like what really makes this film impactful is the way it tackles these uncomfortable truths about identity and how society pressures us to be a certain way and how sometimes, change isn't really what we think it is. The fact that it does all of this through like a mix of dark humor and satire and drama, I think just makes it that much more effective.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just the themes themselves, it's how they all weave together through the performances, the visuals, and soundtrack. It's like a multi-layered experience that makes you think and feel things on different levels, even aesthetically.
And it doesn't sound like there's a simple ending or like a clear moral to this story. It's more about leaving the audience to consider those complexities of transformation. Like, does true change come from within? Or is it shaped by things outside of ourselves?
It seems like the kind of film that really stays with you even after it's over. It makes you think and maybe even talk about it with others, and maybe even question how you see yourself and the world around you.
So for anyone looking for a film that's both entertaining and makes you think A Different Man should definitely be on your list.
Mm.
I mean, it asks those tough questions. It embraces the unknown. And it kind of reminds us that figuring ourselves out can be messy and unpredictable. And it's ultimately, something that's different for each of us.
It makes you wonder, like, the next time you look in the mirror, who are you really seeing? Is it the person you show to the world? Or the person everyone expects you to be? Or maybe the person you're still becoming?
That's a great question to leave us with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into A Different Man. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking as we did. And like always, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.